Start. Hello and welcome to our interview with Alice Rothchild. She is an activist, a physician, a filmmaker, and an author. And we are going to be talking to her about her new middle grade novel. So we'll go ahead and get started. Alice, if you could introduce yourself and tell us about your journey to becoming an author.
Well, it's great to be here. This is my book, my latest book. So my journey, actually, the first time I remember being excited about writing was in sixth grade. I wrote a piece. We had a kid's book on Plato's Republic, and I wrote an essay on Plato's Republic, and it stands out in my mind as like this high point of sixth grade. But I was determined not to be a writer because my mother was a writer, and I saw how lonely and hard that was. And I would say to her, I'm going to be something useful and something people want. I'm not going to be a writer. Little did I know that writers were actually useful and that people want them, but that was, a kid's view. So I became a doctor, and that was about the most useful thing I could imagine. But I found I still needed to write. So throughout my doctoring life, I wrote essays, op-eds, that kind of stuff on I was an OBGYN, so women's reproductive care, health reform, childbirth, menopause, all sorts of medical topics. And then I got involved with working on issues around health and human rights in Israel-Palestine. And then I realized I needed to write about that. And the thing that sort of, making lemonade out of lemons thing that happened was that I had a very severe back injury and ended up out of work for a long time. And during the course of that time, I wrote my first book. And, I did it kicking and screaming. I'm not writing a book, but it had to happen, and it kept my sanity. And it got published, and then it got, second edition, and it got translated into Hebrew and German. And it was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And I was very lucky because this friend of mine had been pushing me to write something, and I said, I'm not writing anything without a publisher, which is utterly ridiculous. And a publisher contacted me and said, I want to publish your book. So I wrote my first book with a publisher saying, you have a story to tell, I want to publish it, which was just a miracle. For my second and third book, I had another miracle experience where I was blogging from Israel-Palestine because I was doing annual delegations and medical work and interviewing people. And this publisher wrote to me and said, your blog should be a book. So it was like, oh my God. So that was the second book. And then the third book was taking a much bigger sweep of blogs and adding an analysis to it. So that, I just became a writer, just sort of accidentally became a writer. And then I contributed to a number of anthologies on all sorts of different topics. So the way I came about writing a book for teenagers is sort of funny. I was giving a talk at a Quaker organization, and this teacher came up to me and said, you should write a book about Palestine for children. And I was like, I do not write books for children. And that night I dreamt a picture book. I was like, oh my goodness. So I wrote it down and I started working on it. And then I realized I didn't know anything about writing books for children because it's a totally different ball game than writing for grown-ups. And so I started taking courses. I joined Seattle Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. I always get that in the wrong order. The Pacific Northwest Writing Association. I got into a critique group, and I basically had created a little MFA for myself. And so I wrote the picture book, turned into a middle grade chapter book, which is being considered by a publisher, but hasn't been published yet. Then I wrote a graphic novel, I'm working with a Gazan artist to see if we can pull that one off. And then I wrote this young adult novel. So, since then I've written a memoir in verse, and I'm working on another book about home births in Seattle. I just keep thinking of things I want to talk about. But I was lucky to find a publisher for the young adult book, so it came out in January.
Well, that's wonderful. And is this, when you started writing for children, was that the first time that you were writing fiction?
Yes.
And so what was that transition like for you?
Well, it's kind of fun because when you're writing fiction, it's kind of like being God. You can say, well, I think this character should do that, and this should happen to that character. You're in charge rather than what happened here and how can I explain it and what's the analysis. And so it's the creativity was fun. The challenge of doing it well was less fun because I had to learn about storytelling and story arc and the bad thing, they always say, take your characters, make people love them, and then make really horrible things happen to them. And that's what you have to do. So that's what I did.
Well, I want to take a step back too and talk about the filmmaking part of it, because I think that's really interesting because filmmaking is also storytelling. How was that process different, or maybe
Yeah.
you found it really similar to writing books?
Well, that's another funny story because, again, I was sort of an accidental filmmaker. So I found when I was doing book tours with my adult books on Israel Palestine that if there were Palestinians in the audience, they would say, I need to tell you my story. And they would tell these incredible stories to me, like this anonymous Jewish woman who happened to be, on the podium. So I thought, I'm going to write a book about the stories that Palestinians tell me, because there's so many stories of refugees and dispossession and survival. And, it's fascinating stuff. So I started interviewing Palestinians in Detroit. I was on a book tour, and there are a lot of big Arab population in Detroit. And through the grapevine, some, lefty progressive cameraman heard this and he said, this should be a movie. And I said, I don't make movies. And he convinced a bunch of people to fly him from California to Detroit. And he arrived with all his, big umbrella things to reflect the light and all these things. I had no idea what he was doing. And he just followed me around and videoed all the interviews. And they were incredible interviews because, when you sit down with someone in a quiet room and look them in the eye and say, tell me what happened, people tell you. And people who hadn't thought about, when they were 12 in 1948 and the soldiers came in and shot their brother and the family grabbed everything and ran, they had suppressed all that. And then having someone listen, people started crying. I mean, all sorts of heavy things happen. And, I think part of my doctor skills is that I can create like a little safe place where people can tell me what's going on. So I had all this incredible footage and I was going to give it to some film friend, I didn't know who, and I would go write my book. And then all my film friends said, this is your film. And I was like, I don't make movies. And then I was talking with a professor of film and she said, look, we could do this together. And I thought, how hard could it be? It's like storytelling, right? Wrong, because it's visual storytelling. And also you have to know how to physically make a film. So I started looking for a film editor who would work with me to produce this film. And I met this fabulous woman, Sharon Mullally. And so she and I began the process. And then I realized I needed a lot more interviews. And then guess what? You can't have a film of talking heads. You have to have visuals because it's a visual medium. So then I embarked on the whole, saga of finding photos and getting family photos and getting footage from the UN from 48. And, it just was like, I was thinking, oh, this will take a year. Well, it took 4 years. There was like a big fundraising campaign because guess what? You have to pay for videos. And, I was doing most of the stuff was volunteer stuff, but, the footage you had to pay for, the making the film you had to pay for. So this was like a real education for me. And I kind of wish I knew what I knew afterwards at the beginning, but that's how life is. So the film was put together and it actually premiered at the Boston Palestine Film Festival and won an audience award, which was stunning to me. It was so exciting that I was able to touch something deep in people and tell it well enough for people to be moved. And, so it has a little life of its own. It's been to different little film festivals and at various, anniversaries in Palestinian history, people show it and talk about what happened in 48 and 67 and Palestinian history. It's a very like welcoming people in kind of film that says, follow, come with me, and I'll show you what I learned kind of thing. But I wanted to, I learned the history from the Jewish point of view, and I wanted the history told in the voices of Palestinians. So that's the film. And there's a website for it. It's called Voices Across the Divide. It's now available on Vimeo. Everybody should watch it, but it's there.
That's wonderful, and it relates completely to your new book, which I want to make sure we talk about that because again, it's about the Israel-Palestine conflict, and you've also talked about, well, I want to talk about your book first, and then I also want to make sure we get to talk about just in general the idea of this erasure of Palestine in children's literature. When I say children's literature, I mean, up to
the whole spread,
right? Yeah, the whole spectrum up to YA. So what exactly that means and then how your book kind of fits into that is helping to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, with this book, I wanted to write something for young adults, and young adults, start, this is probably appropriate for like 15 to 85, you know. And I wanted it to be a book about three teenagers and struggling with the kind of things that teenagers struggle with. But I wanted to have some of the drama take place in Palestine, because part of my motivation for writing these kids' books is that there are so few books on Palestine for children. So the way I played with it is I had the protagonist, the main protagonist, whose name is Melody Sullivan, has a Jewish mother and a Catholic father. Mother's died of breast cancer. She's this depressed, angsty teenager who's not a very happy camper, writes poetry to pour her heart out into her, poetry. And her best friend is a Palestinian American. And they both live in some big college town in Vermont. And so they're two teenage girls, and the friend is a year older than her. And the friend is like her rock and has been through all of the trauma of the mother dying and the father being sort of a distant professor father who's not, as she said, hasn't read the parenting book yet. And then, you need some love and you need a boy. So the third protagonist is a young man who they all went to preschool together. So they've known each other for years. And he's a religious Jewish kid who is very involved in his temple. He wears a yarmulke. So we have a yarmulke wearing guy, hijabi wearing girl, and the secular depressed person in the middle. So I had to figure out how they could all interact. And they also then can represent different voices in this conflict, obviously. So, something has to happen. Her father gets a paper accepted at a conference in Jerusalem. He's an archaeologist. He decides to take his daughter, who would rather, go to the moon than go to anywhere with her father, to Jerusalem. And so various things happen there. And so she's like exposed to like, what's Israel like? What's Tel Aviv like? And this excites the boy, the guy, because he's like, I wish I could go with you. This is so exciting, blah, blah, blah. So various things happen with them. And she's also, and I'm dealing with the kind of trauma of loss and your mother dying and, who am I and how can I live a life and all those teen kind of issues. And meanwhile, her Palestinian friend is visiting family in Hebron in the West Bank. Which she thinks is like, you look at the map, it's right next door. Her fantasy was that they would get together and explore things together. So she has no understanding that her friend can't come to Jerusalem and that there are checkpoints and, So various terrible things happen because that's what happens in a novel. And she decides that she's going to go to Hebron. She's got to see her friend. And she actually figures out where the Arab bus station is and gets on a bus. And then she thinks, oh my God, what am I doing? And, she has this journey to her friend, which is basically narrated by various, like the woman sitting next to her in the bus, the taxi driver, various people she meets that explain to her what occupation is about. And she sort of wakes up like, oh my God, there's all sorts of suffering here. And there's all sorts of resilience. And my private disaster is not the only disaster in the world. So it's like this awakening for her. And then she arrives at her friend's house where she gets to see a Palestinian family that's multiple kids and multiple generations and a huge amount of love and food. And she doesn't know it, but what she's looking for is this family, obviously, because she needs family. So her healing process happens with this family. Meanwhile, her father is furious, obviously, that she just split and ran off to the West Bank. And she's going to get, kidnapped and die. And so it ends up with him storming in and, they have to have some resolution. So there's a lot of drama. And there's a lot of sort of big questions being asked, but in the context of the lives of these three teenagers. And they each have to struggle because the Palestinian American girl has kept this whole side of her life secret from her best friend. And there are reasons for it. And she has to figure out what to do with that. And her best friend has to realize that she's not the only wounded person in the world. And there's all these other things to be thinking about. And the Jewish guy has to figure out, wait a minute, this isn't the story I was told. I can't believe this is happening to you, but you're sending me photos. What am I going to do? So he's got to struggle. So they all have a story arc and they all have a personal development arc that I think keeps it interesting. And, since lots of bad things happen and then good things happen, it's a little bit of a page turner that you have to read the next chapter to see how they get out of that one, So that's how the book is.
And then how do you feel like, I know you talked about how as a fiction writer, you get to kind of decide what happens to everybody. And so you can really maybe go more in depth about issues that than maybe in an article, but also it seems like it really touches on that emotional level that maybe an article wouldn't.
Yeah, it's a
Was
whole
that
different.
kind of,
Yeah, it's very different, right? Right. Also, in fiction, another thing I was playing with is how do people communicate? Because one of the big issues here is that people talk past each other. So I had, people communicate by talking to each other, by writing poetry. There's a huge amount of texting that goes on. There are notes that get written. There's all sorts of ways that people are trying to contact each other. So I'm playing with the whole communication thing as well, and the miscommunication thing.
And I also love how, like you said, like they represent kind of different voices and different experiences that people have. And I think that's, I'm sure one of the issues that comes up with the Palestine and Israeli conflict is that sometimes people aren't even talking about the same thing. I mean, we think we're talking about the same thing, but we're not, because the experiences are so different and the viewpoints are so contrasting. Like you said, there's a lot of miscommunication that happens. Can you talk kind of generally about how Palestine is represented or not represented in children's literature, and
Mhm.
why that has come about, or what do you think the gaps are that you're trying to fill? I mean, and you've mentioned erasure, is there also misrepresentation that's happening, or just kind of not talking about Palestinian points of view?
Right, right. So it's interesting. I'm doing a project with another author who's just written a young adult book that also is about Palestine. So I'm actually researching this topic. And it turns out that there are very, very few books, good books for kids of any age group on the topic. And partly it's because there's a sort of stereotype of, the Palestinian terrorist, misogynist, that you see in the papers that has very little to do with reality. So it's a maligned subgroup in the world. And partly this has happened because the dominant narrative is the Israeli narrative, the Jewish Israeli narrative, that Israel is this miracle that was born out of the tragedy of the Holocaust, and it's a country that cannot be criticized because of the uniqueness of Jewish trauma. And it's a big, military ally of the US. I mean, there are all these things that make the sort of dominant narrative erase the actuality of Palestinian life. So that's the culture we live and breathe in. So to break through that culture, you need, first of all, authors who are willing to write about this. And there has been, when I started this work in the 90s, there was very little being written in English by Palestinian writers for kids. It just was an absent thing. And now there are many, many more books being written. Not much in the young adult world, though, and still just a teensy bit compared to the vast number of other books. And, there are groups that are sort of fashionable to write about, refugee groups that everybody's heartstrings, throb when they hear about them. But this is a refugee group that has been forgotten, maligned, discredited. And the other thing that happens is that when people, teachers, librarians try to work with books about Palestine, there's a huge amount of pushback. So what we're doing is interviewing teachers and librarians and documenting people get, they lose their jobs, they get called in, and accused of anti-Semitism. There's all sorts of pushback that happens for people who try to teach this stuff. And, there are teachers who've been doxxed and who've, had death threats because they used a book that was sympathetic to Palestinians or critical of the Israeli occupation. And it turns out that there is a sort of industry, a huge industry, that monitors all speech on Palestine and Israel, and that will go after people who deviate from the accepted norm, which is that the Israelis are good and the Palestinians are bad. And, that whole bipolar kind of situation, which is clearly not at all the reality. And it's not that Israelis are all bad and Palestinians are all good. It's just that this is a complicated historical narrative that involves imperialism and settler colonialism and racism and all sorts of things, and Holocaust and trauma. Everybody's got their trauma here. But I think it's very important to explore more honestly the history than the version I got in Hebrew school. So there's a muzzling that goes on and a censorship, and so it's risky. I mean, there was a book called P is for Palestine that was an ABC book, and it came out, and the bookstore that carried it had huge pushback because I was for Intifada. Well, the people who were, having a nervous breakdown about I is for Intifada said, this is supporting terrorism, blah, blah, blah. Well, intifada is also an Arabic word for rising up against oppression, which is a perfectly reasonable thing that anyone should be rising up against oppression. But, temples were up in arms and there was a big hoo-ha and social media. This is about an alphabet book. So you can imagine if you write something a little more complicated, what kind of craziness is potentially possible. So it's a place that people take a lot of risk to teach or to read. And it makes people, it's sort of, I always say the books are kind of pre-banned before they're written. Like, why do that? Because it's only going to get you in more trouble. But I think it's very important if we're going to, teach our kids in a way that's anti-racist, that understands colonialism, that understands that there are different narratives and there are wars and people suffer. And, if we're going to be honest about that with our children, then we have to have these books. So writing a book about Palestine isn't only about Palestine. It's about refugees. It's about racism. It's about colonialism. It's about stereotyping. It's all those things, sort of tucked into an interesting story that hopefully you won't notice all the other heavy topics going on because you're so engrossed with the book. And then at the end, you've had this education that you didn't know you got about these major issues that I think the children have a right to think about. The whole book banning, censorship thing that's going on. No one talks about the rights of children to know what's going on. And I really believe that children have a right to know complicated things, age appropriate. But that saying they can't know this or they can't, it is really detrimental to their ability to function, in a pluralistic democracy, or to be knowledgeable about, the Arab world is like this big bad mystery for most Americans. It's important that we understand more about the Arab world. So this is part of my motivation.
Yeah, and can you talk about what kind of reaction you've gotten? I mean, there are the books that you've written previously, but now that you come out with fiction, YA, is the reaction that you've gotten differently? Because I imagine you've gotten a
Yeah.
lot of pushback on your work. Is it different when it's in this format, or I mean, do you think it kind of, like you say, it might kind of slip under the radar a little bit, or not so much?
Well, first of all, the book's only been out for a couple of weeks, so I don't know what the big reaction is going to be. And I've had my, share of crazy pushback and death threats and all that kind of. But so I don't know. I haven't been noticed by the big powers that be yet. And maybe, because it's called Finding Melody Sullivan, no one's going to know it's a book about Palestine, which is fine with me. But I've had a very, the people who contact me and the people who come to my book, I've done 2 book readings that were just packed and were very receptive and really love the book. So I haven't had anyone write to me and say, that's a horrible book and how dare you write it, but people generally don't do that. And it hasn't been out long enough to cause any trouble, I think. I'm really trying very hard to get into schools and libraries and temples and mosques and churches and, try to find ways to talk with people. And then hopefully it'll create more of a stir. But, with young adult books, you're selling to the parents and the librarians and the teachers. You're not selling to the kids because they don't tend to buy the book. So, but you want the kids to be interested in reading the book. So the marketing thing is complicated.
Right, a bit of a balance there. Well, thank you for all that you're doing. I want to be respectful of your time, so I'll go ahead and end it here. But we really appreciate what you're doing and appreciate you taking the time, especially we had some technical difficulties, so this is a little more of your time than you had anticipated taking, but I hope it was worth it for you. I know it'll be worth it for our audience to get to hear from you and to find out more about your book. Again, that's Finding Melody Sullivan. And I'm sorry, I think I said earlier it was middle grade. It's a YA book.
YA,
So I apologize for that.
And I have a website. It's AliceRothchildBooks.com. It has a teacher's guide. I'm putting up more resources. When we have our project done about exploring the censorship and absence of Palestinian books, books about Palestine, I will have that up there. So it's going to grow. The website's going to grow.
Wonderful. And you also said, and the name of the film you mentioned earlier was Voices Across the Divide.
Yeah.
So so everybody should look for that also.
On
That's
Vimeo.
All right. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.